I'd just like to say thank you to Ermine as well for her sharing of such a terrible and traumatic experience, which is not just a one-off. As Ermine said in her video, that she's experienced that from childhood to adulthood. And I can relate to some of that. And so when I was asked, you know, what can we do to effectively challenge racism in a chaplaincy context, the first thing that sprung to mind for me was the fact that we have to challenge and we can't remain silent. Because remaining silent is not a benign process. It's not a benign action. There are significant consequences for that silence, because it gives authority to those who may wish to commit racist acts to continue to do so without challenge. But as we know, there are other forms of racism, as well as the overt, there's the institutional. And so today I'm going to spend a few moments reflecting on what's happened over the last year or so in terms of the pandemic, because the spotlight on racism really did come through that year. So for me, it just helps to contextualize some of the important factors that we need to remember. And particularly for yourselves, as I think chaplains, in a sense, you're in the community. You see the society as it is, whether that's in a hospital, a care home, a college, a university, and you'll come across these issues. And yes, indeed, within our church. When, you know, Meg, thank you so much for sharing that video. And one thing that struck me was the words that said, blessed are those who mourn, whose tears could fill an ocean, or words to that effect. And I thought that was really, really powerful. And none of us have been untouched by COVID-19 and the global pandemic that has impacted all societies across the globe. None of us have escaped it. But for me, COVID-19 shone a light on existing inequalities that still exist within our country. And for me, these inequalities weren't new. So I just wanted to just go through some of that. What was interesting for me was that, you know, within the first few months of COVID-19, we started to see pictures of NHS workers who had contracted COVID and had passed away. And the thing that struck me, and I think, you know, struck all of us, was the fact that they were Black and Asian people from those communities, week after week. That's not to say, you know, other ethnic groups, other people weren't dying. Yes, of course they were. We've all been impacted. But what struck me was the disproportionality. In my own church, you know, I'm a Methodist, and I go to church in Harlesden in London. And I think we've lost about 12 people. 12 people, 12 wonderful human beings to COVID-19. Bus drivers, NHS workers, you know, people working on the front line. And in a sense, you're working on the front line as chaplains. So why that inequality? Why did we see that disproportionality? And this is my view. We saw a disproportionate impact. One, there were underlying health inequalities that have existed for decades. In the UK. I think that there are issues in terms of deprivation and poverty of where people find themselves. And certainly when you started to examine the occupations of individuals and where they found themselves, that played a factor. But the issue of deprivation is one that I want to explore further, and just want to share with you some facts. That 70% of Black and Asian minority communities live in the 10% most deprived areas of the UK. 70% of all Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities live in the 10% most deprived areas in the UK. What does that mean? It means there are issues in terms of access to services. There are issues in terms of unemployment. There are issues in terms of housing and overcrowding. There's issues in terms of unemployment. A whole range of challenges. And I suspect that many of you, as chaplains, depending on where it is in the region that you find yourself, would have an insight into some of this. And so for me, that's what COVID shone a light on. Existing inequalities that we knew about. But the fact that we knew about it, and when I say we, the government knew about this, but yet it didn't feature in any proactive mitigation to reduce risk for those communities. You know, we saw the debacle in terms of protective equipment. It took so many months to get that right. And for me, you know, thousands of people have died unnecessarily if we'd been proactive. If the country had been proactive. When I say the country, I mean our government. During that period, we witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And in fact, back in May 25th, was a year since the death of George Floyd. And as we know, that's but his death, he died at the hands of a police officer in the United States. He was an African American. And he died at the hands of a police officer. Oh, sorry. He died at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis. But what happened following his death was a global protest. We saw protests all over the world. And I'll ask you this question just to reflect upon, you know, by yourself. What was so different about the death of George Floyd? Why did we witness the global protests that we saw? What was so different about his death compared to the hundreds of African American citizens that have died in the past at the hands of police officers? What was different? What sparked that outrage? What was that? This is my take on it. We're in lockdown. We're working from home. We can't get out and we can't get down to the pub or do what we would usually do. We're in lockdown. And these pictures of the slaughter of an African American was beamed into our homes, was beamed into our living rooms. It was beamed into our living rooms and we couldn't escape it. Now, you might have a different take on this, but that's my view, is that if it hadn't been for the pandemic and the lockdown, I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been a reaction, but it amplified the horror, the injustice that took place. And as I say, unfortunately, it wasn't a unique incident. It wasn't a unique incident. And so for me, that's what that whole outcry and demonstrations that we saw here in the UK was because we are in the middle of a pandemic. The conversations which took place around race as a result of George Floyd's death was because of the pandemic. And I think society, humanity was calling out for justice. And I think, you know, if there's any good that's come of this, is the fact that I think the world wanted to see and still wants to see change. So one of the things that I look back on, you know, many organisations away from the Methodist Church engaged in conversation, and they said that, you know, the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, sparked action, sparked conversation to address the issues of racism. But the Methodist Church has been looking at these issues for decades, and as part of who we are as Methodists is to challenge social injustice, not just racism, but injustice in general, across the whole raft of societal ills and challenges. And I wanted to reflect back on a particular milestone that I see as being important. In 1978, the Methodist Church in Britain made the following statement: "Racism is a sin and contrary to the imperatives of the gospel. Biblically, it is against all that we perceive of the unmotivated, spontaneous and undiscriminating love of God, who in Jesus Christ gave himself for all." As Christian people, we believe that with the coming of Jesus Christ, a new relationship was initiated between people of different origins. And for me, I think that was a watershed moment in terms of racial justice within the Methodist Church. And the church has been doing work decades before that statement. But I just wanted to bring it back to your attention that we can, you know, reflect upon that statement, which I think was very powerful. And I think indeed we've come to a point where I believe we're at another watershed. And that watershed moment is tied up in the Methodist Church strategy for justice, dignity, and solidarity. Now, I've got to say up front that this strategy, whilst it tackles issues of racism, it's not solely or exclusively about race. We look at issues of homophobia, we look at gender issues, LGBT issues, you know, a whole range of different challenges that we face as a church. And I just wanted to take a few moments to talk you through how, you know, we came to the strategy, because it was made up of, really co-authored by about 40 people from across the connection. Those 40 people were split into 5 work streams. And I'm going to run through this really quickly. But the 5 work streams, I think, have relevance to the subject that we're looking at today. The first work stream, attitudinal, cultural and systemic change. Recognising that if we want to see change, we have to be the change that we wish to see. And so it starts with the individual, attitudinal change. It has to begin with the way we look at difference, the way who we celebrate, what we celebrate within the church. Are there cultural issues that we need to address, or do we need to change some of our existing? And then, of course, there's the systemic issues. You know, how do we ensure all can take part in the life of the church, and that we represent all of our members, irrespective of ethnicity, that they're reflected in all aspects of church life, including leadership. Are there procedures or practice which inhibit that? And that's what that first work stream looked at. The second, building trust and confidence, recognised that as a church we had let some people down because we hadn't dealt with discrimination, whether that was racism or whether that was homophobia, that we'd let down communities of people. And as a result of that, there are people today, significant numbers of people, who do not believe as a church that we have the capability or the determination to address some of these issues. And that's why this element was really important, to start to address those concerns and to demonstrate as a church that this is our direction of travel and that we are serious in tackling discrimination. The third element, minimum standards. In fact, the name minimum standards was dropped and it was called setting the bar. And that's really just looking at what would you expect to see, whether you are in Cumbria or Cornwall or in Cardiff, London. What would you expect to see in terms of minimum standards? What would your welcome be at your local chapel or church or circuit? What would those standards be? So a number of standards have been set. Positive action. Now, positive action, it takes its name from the Equalities Act 2010. And under the Equalities Act, there is a provision that allow organisations to take positive steps in ensuring that underrepresented groups can be encouraged to take part, to be represented across the organisation. And in terms of the church, we're looking to use those provisions to ensure that there is greater representation and better participation amongst particular communities of people. The last work stream, scrutiny and transparency, and that's acknowledging the fact that there are so many procedures and practices that we have within the church that for many of our members and visitors, it's not visible to them, it's not accessible to them. How do you make that decision? How do I get to go to conference? How did you make that particular decision or give that particular grant? And so what we're working on here is making things a lot more transparent and a lot more accessible to all of our members and visitors. I'm going to whiz through this now because I know that I'm running out of time. I just want to share with you just the aims of the strategy. And I'll read it because I know some of you are on mobile devices. So the three aims of this: for a paradigm shift in the culture of the church, practices and attitudes of the Methodist Church, so that all Methodists are able to be full participants in the church's life. Second aim, to eradicate all discrimination and coercive control within the Methodist Church, and for all people to be treated justly and with dignity across the breadth of the Methodist Church. And the third aim, for the rich diversity of people within the Methodist Church to be recognised as a cause for thanksgiving, celebration and praise. There are over 20 recommendations in the report, and it's going before a conference this summer, so in the next week or so. And I would urge all of you to engage with it because it impacts every single aspect of church life. And I've just brought to your attention 4 areas that I feel impact on or have a context with our discussions today. One of the recommendations, discrimination response system. We will be setting up a response system that anybody in our connection who is experiencing discrimination or feels that they are being treated differently because of a protected characteristic, or feels that they have been excluded, that they will be able to get immediate support. And that might be signposting, it might be therapeutic support, it might be pastoral support, but you will get immediate support because we've recognized in the past that we haven't been as responsive as we should be. Now, that doesn't take away from all the other procedures that we have in place, such as Part 11 for complaints, etc. We will have a truth and reconciliation process. Now, that sounds really grand, and that's going to run for approximately a year, but it will be a themed process. So we will look, for instance, as an example, we will look at the process of stationing, and we will be calling for evidence from those who feel that they've been discriminated through the stationing process. And we'll be looking at various processes that we have within the church. And again, just asking for people to come forward if they believe that they have been treated unfairly as a result of a process that we have. And it's not just listening, it's about responding and, where necessary, adjusting, changing, perhaps even getting rid of certain processes. Another recommendation, personal responsibility covenant. The personal responsibility covenant is where an individual has perhaps been homophobic, racist, whatever, and this is trying to help this individual address their behaviour and attitudes. And so they make a covenant with us as a church, covenant with God, in terms of their responsibility for change, and we will put support mechanisms in place to support that individual. And if that doesn't work, then there are a whole range of sanctions. But well before that, it's looking at the support that we can give to that individual. The last one is a whole series of symposia, hearing from those that have experienced discrimination, and for different regions to respond to that in terms of what we might do. So a bit like what we're doing today. The reason that I've put these in front of you is really to ask for your help. We are looking for volunteer chaplains to assist in the delivery of the Justice, Dignity and Solidarity report. We'll be recruiting EDI officers across the district, across districts and circuit levels, but you know, the recommendations that I've just gone through with you, the discrimination response system, the truth and reconciliation process, for some people, just like Ermin had gone through and had shared with you her experience, for some people that'd be really distressing. There'll be psychological trauma, perhaps. And what we'd like are for chaplains that would be willing to work with us to be part of this process. And if you would like to be part of the process, then please contact Reverend Jill Marsh. You can, or myself. And for those of you that can see the screen, that our email addresses is there. I'm just wondering, Gary or James, whether perhaps we could put those contact details in the chat, maybe, so that
doing it now, Bevan. Just doing it now.
Thank you. So I think I've gone slightly over time, but what I wanted to do was just to say, look, as a church, we're trying to address these issues. We've been working on these issues for decades. So it hasn't taken George Floyd, although George Floyd and the pandemic has helped focus minds on a whole range of inequality. But collectively, whether chaplains or whether those at Church House, our superintendent ministers, our deacons, collectively, we can start to make major inroads. And I'm really looking forward to working with any of you who would like to be part of this journey in terms of implementing this strategy. So thank you very much for listening.